I think to understand the significance of the labor ministers meeting, you have to go back a bit in time. So the G20, let's remember, was actually established in 1999. It was a finance ministers forum to address the Asian financial crisis, which had succeeded the Latin American financial crisis and preceded the global financial crisis. At a certain point, it was recognized that the G7 could not solve the problems of the global economy because it was a shrinking share. And so the G20, which had been formed by finance ministers to fight a huge regional crisis in Asia, when the global financial crisis hit, it became a forum for heads of state. In fact, they met in London, and then they met in Washington and Pittsburgh, and they declared themselves the premier forum for international economic cooperation to address the crisis. One of the biggest impacts of the crisis, of course, was soaring unemployment, if you think back to 2007, 2008, 2009. And so by 2010, the leaders, actually led by President Obama in the US, suggested that they should get their labor ministers together to talk about the employment aspects. They met in Washington in 2010, and they've been meeting every year since. So actually now the labor ministers meet every year, just like the finance ministers. There's really no other group of ministers who always meet as part of the G20, and it's a recognition that this crisis is not over. The employment crisis is not over. The legacy of unemployment is still high and still painful in many countries. And so the G20, if they want to see a global recovery, they've got to look at labor markets. The labor markets of the G20, by and large, have not recovered from the crisis. So some economies are doing better than others. US unemployment has gone down, for example. German unemployment has gone down. On the other hand, you have Spain with 24–25% unemployment. You have high unemployment in many G20 countries. The emerging G20 economies didn't really experience the crisis as open unemployment. They experienced it as disguised unemployment, underemployment, part-time, involuntary part-time work, people moving to the informal sector because they couldn't find formal jobs that had benefits and good pay. So, but across the G20, there is not really a labor market that's thriving, that's creating the number of jobs that are needed to absorb those who are currently unemployed or underemployed and those young people coming into the labor market each year as they get out of school. So there's really no room for complacency in the G20 when it comes to employment. Actually, this year was in some ways a significant breakthrough. Last year, after 4 years of meeting at the labor ministerial level, the leaders called on the labor ministers in 2014, this year, to develop full employment plans. In other words, plans that diagnose what are the problems in your particular economy, why are there not enough jobs, why are there not enough good jobs, and then make a plan, a coherent plan to respond to it. So all 20 countries developed these employment plans, and indeed the leaders called on the finance ministers to develop overall growth strategies with employment as a key component. So for the first time, instead of what you might call ad hoc commitments by countries, which they had made in the past, saying, well, we can do this, you can do that, and together hopefully it will make some progress, this year it was meant to be more systematic. And so the president this year, which was Australia, actually took on the heavy responsibility of devising a way for the countries to develop these employment plans and growth strategies that would be reasonably consistent in the approach taken. Not in the policies, because they're different countries with different needs, but a template of how you develop a diagnosis and a set of responsive policies. And all the 20 countries did submit these employment plans to the labor ministers. The labor ministers gave each other feedback on them, and they're going to take one more pass at it and then submit the final employment plans and growth strategies to the leaders when they meet at a summit in Brisbane, Australia in November of this year. In the global economy right now, there is a very strong debate going on about whether the problem of slow growth globally, the problem of slow job creation, is it a problem which is cyclical, meaning that it's still a legacy of the crisis and that we just haven't recovered from the crisis? Or is it structural, meaning there's some changes in these economies that need to be made and laws and so on? This is a debate that the ILO has been very much involved in, and we've done quite a bit of research to try to show what the patterns have been so that we at least get a foundation agreement on what is the problem. If you don't understand what is the problem, it's very hard to say, let's all pursue a particular solution. A major long-term structural problem is that what's called the labor share of GDP. So in global domestic product, in gross domestic product in countries, one of the many ways you can look at it is what share goes to owners of capital, so what's the return on investment, and what share goes to wages and salaries and benefits. And the labor share has been declining in almost all G20 countries, in some cases for 20, 30, even 40 years. Well, at the end of the day, if the labor share is declining, that's you and me and the 90% of the population whose income is based on wages, salaries, and earnings at work. If that share is declining, you have profits, yes, but you're not going to have investment in productive capacity because you can't sell to those people whose share of your economy is declining. That's what we see in so many of the economies, but ILO research has shown that this is true actually in all but one of the G20 countries. So it's a pervasive problem, whether it's a high income, middle income, emerging economy, advanced economy, it's a pervasive problem, and we think that addressing that is going to have to be part of the solution. In many emerging economies, the informal sector, that means businesses that are not registered with the government, they don't pay taxes, they don't come under the enforcement of labor laws, minimum wages, they don't pay contributions to pensions or unemployment systems. That can be as much as 50, 60, 70, even 80% of emerging economies. Well, when you think about that, trying to solve the problem of not enough jobs but also not enough good quality jobs means that you have to begin lifting up those people who are working in the informal economy and get them into better jobs, get them ultimately into formal jobs. This is something that the ILO has been working intensely on. Indeed, we're working to try to develop a recommendation that would be agreed by all of our member countries and employers and workers about the best ways of doing that. But it's gotten onto the G20 agenda because countries like India and China and Brazil and Argentina insisted that this also has to get attention. Youth unemployment is emerging as a major issue in virtually every economy. China, which has been growing fast and has created a lot of jobs, has actually been raising wages very rapidly. Right now, their biggest problem with not being able to find jobs for their citizens who want them is the recent college grads. So they have a bumper crop of college graduates. More and more Chinese young people are going to college, the way that it happened in the West in the 70s and 60s in some cases. And they're coming out, but the labor market hasn't adapted yet to the reality of these well-educated young people. And so they're not able to find jobs that meet their qualifications or their expectations. So big problem in China, many other emerging economies, and of course, a huge problem in many parts of Europe, where we see in some countries half of all youth are unemployed. A major, major crisis, the fear of a lost generation. So that was very much on the agenda. Many, many commitments from the governments and their employment plans on youth. Also a lot of attention to trying to bring more women into the labor force. Bringing women into the labor force, a basic matter of equity, opportunity, but also as you see many societies aging, it's going to become an important part of maintaining a labor force that's still growing. Otherwise, we could see a labor force that's shrinking in many countries, and that's not good for economies. You don't want to see your labor force shrink. You don't want to see people staying home and not working. It's not good for the economy, but also work should be a form of not only income, but a form of self-expression, self-realization, camaraderie, being out with your peers. And so getting more women into the labor force was agreed to be a major priority for all of the G20. No reason for complacency. Labor markets have not recovered. A big structural problem is the declining labor share, which is based on stagnant or declining wages and cutbacks in social protection, unemployment benefits, and so on. We are in a downward spiral right now, which is self-reinforcing. We need to break that spiral somewhere. We think you can do it in the labor market through minimum wages, through collective bargaining, through improvements in social protection. And then you have households spending more, and then the firms start to invest more, and basically government gets more tax revenue. They can pay down their debt without cutting services. You get on an upward spiral instead of what we're on right now, which is an downward spiral. That's our message. That's, we say it differently in different contexts depending on whether we're talking to economists or to the public, but that's really our message. It's a process of learning. It's a process of asking international organizations like the ILO, World Bank, et cetera, to do research, bring knowledge to the group, developing a consensus on what can and should be done, and then making the agreement that we will all do this together, because one country adopting a policy will have some benefit. If the 20 biggest economies in the world adopt a policy, it could have enormous benefits for everybody and spill over to the rest of the economies in the world as well.